You know, it's become increasingly commonplace to hear people referring to God as mother, or sometimes they'll say mother and father, or they'll refer to God as the heavenly parent. And you see this in written literature, and maybe you've even experienced a worship service somewhere where someone prayed to God as our mother in heaven or something along those lines. Perhaps it was in your church, perhaps it was in a community ecumenical service of some kind. And what I have found is that while for a long time Christians were well served by their instincts to just say, look, when the Bible names God, it names him Father, it doesn't name him Mother. And when Jesus teaches us how to pray, he teaches us to pray to Father, not to Mother, and that was sufficient. But what I've found is that when these more subtle biblical arguments are made, and people are trying to reason from the biblical text to calling God Mother, that most Christians feel that they're not as well equipped to answer the question. And so what I want to do here is I want to make the case that it is in fact inappropriate to refer to God as Mother. But I want to summarize the argument that's often made by people who are claiming to work from the scriptures toward the idea that we should call God Mother. I want to summarize the argument, and I want to respond to it in order to make my case. So what is the argument that is made from Scripture for why we should call God Mother? Well, kind of step one of the argument is to say, if you're reading Scripture carefully, then you're going to notice that the Scriptures do use motherly imagery and motherly metaphors for God. And there are a number of places we could appeal to. Isaiah 46 is one where God refers to Israel as being brought forth from his womb. And that's clearly motherly imagery, where he's describing in poetic terms the way that he gave Israel life and brought them forth, and he makes the comparison to Israel coming forth from his womb. Another example is just a couple of chapters later in Isaiah 49. We have God referring to his bringing Israel through the wilderness and comparing that to a mother nursing her young. And so people will say there's these motherly metaphors for God, and that's true. Okay, we need to acknowledge that Scripture does have a wealth of motherly imagery by which to describe God, especially God in his relation to his people. But then they'll move from that and say, now it's also the case that Scripture teaches that God is not a male deity. That is, God is not biologically sexed as a male. And this, of course, is also true, right? Scripture is very clear that God is a pure spirit, an immaterial spirit. He doesn't have a body of flesh and bones, and therefore the biological category of male and female is not applicable to him. He is neither male nor female in the biologically sexed sense. Now, of course, when I say that God is not a male deity, we acknowledge that the second person of the Trinity, who is truly and fully God, assumed a human nature in the incarnation. And according to that human nature, he's a male human being. And so he is God and he is male, but his maleness is according to his human nature, not according to his divine nature. So it's still the case, even though the Son became incarnate, that God is not a male deity. So you take these two facts, the Bible has motherly metaphors for God, God is not a male deity, and that brings you to then the next kind of major movement here, and that is the argument that the name Father, therefore, and other masculine names for God and masculine references to God, like pronouns, must be metaphorical, because literal fathers are males. God's not a male, therefore when we call God Father, it must be a metaphorical name. Now you take those three things, you put them together, and you can start to see the argument really taking shape. If God uses metaphorical motherly imagery to refer to himself in Scripture, and he uses the divine name Father to refer to himself, and that's also a metaphor, this seems to legitimize us calling God Mother. And usually what people making this argument will say is that the reason Father was so prominent is because in the culture in which the Bible was written, you had a very patriarchal culture where it would have been offensive to people to think of God in these feminine ways. And so you get a much more prominent sort of masculine naming pattern for God, and they'll appeal to that. That's a much more sophisticated biblical argument than most Christians are accustomed to encountering. And you see this in a lot of literature today. So how would I respond to that? Well, of course, I acknowledge the use of motherly metaphors, and we should embrace those. They're divinely given, and we should be instructed by those, and certainly acknowledge the biblical truth that God is not a male deity, that God is an immaterial, pure spirit. He's not embodied. And so those are true claims. Where I want to contest the argument is the premise that Father is a metaphorical name. And I think that's actually a fundamental mistake. And what often happens is people will say, because God is not a father in ways that are identical to how human fathers are fathers, therefore it must be a metaphor. But this fails to recognize the fact that God is infinite and incomprehensible, meaning that though we can know God truly on account of his revelation of himself, we cannot know him perfectly as he knows himself. Therefore, all of our language about God is analogical. And analogical language just means that there's an analogy when we speak about God, no matter how we're speaking about him, no matter what words we're using, however true those words are, the words that I use to describe God do not mean identically the same thing in God that they mean to my understanding. I recognize that when I speak about God's power, for example, I'm applying that to God, and I'm speaking about something that's true of God in ways that are beyond my comprehension. I can't fully comprehend what it means for God to be powerful, but there's an analogous correspondence between power as I understand it and power as it's true of God. And so I can say truly God is powerful while recognizing that I don't comprehend the fullness of what that means. And so with all of our language about God. So if you could imagine like a diagram here, imagine that at the top of this diagram is the word analogical language, right? All of our speech about God is analogical. And then under analogical, you have two broad types of analogical language that occur in Scripture. One of them is figurative language. So you have analogical language, and over here you would have figurative language. And figurative language is language that uses a figure of speech that draws on something that's proper to the created order, and by way of metaphor or simile applies it to God. An easy example of this is when we call God a rock, right? Over and over in Scripture, the prophetic literature, the Psalms, we have God being referred to as a rock, our rock, right? And we recognize that this is not speech about God that's saying that he's made of minerals and relatively hard to the touch or something like that. We recognize that there are properties of rocks that by way of metaphorical extension can communicate truth about God, like its relative constancy, its relative unchangeability. It speaks to us about God's ultimate unchangeability. Its relative strength speaks to us about God's infinite strength. But the name rock, when applied to God, is drawn from the created order and applied to God by way of metaphor. So there's an analogy between rock and God in this way of speaking, but the direction of the analogy is moving from creation up to God. That's how figurative language works. It's a figure of speech, and so metaphor and simile fits this category. But under analogical language, we also have proper speech. And proper speech is speech about God where though it's analogous, it's still analogical language, the analogy runs from God down to creatures. And what we mean by that is that these are things we say about God that are properly true of God first. They're true of God prior to being true of creatures or even in creaturely understanding in an analogous way. So things like the divine names, I am, Yahweh, divine attributes, these are going to fit under this proper category. So when I say God is powerful, I recognize that God's power is original to him. And power as possessed by creatures and power as understood by creatures is analogous to that, but the original's in God, the analogy's in the creature. So it's the opposite of figurative, where the original's in the creature and the analogy's in God. Proper speech runs the other way. And what's interesting in Scripture about the name Father is that I think Scripture tells us explicitly that the name Father belongs on this proper side. That is, it's not metaphorical. It's not a figure of speech. And the text I have in mind is Ephesians 3:14 and 15, where Paul says, I pray to the Father, I bow my knees to the Father. And then if you're reading in a modern translation, verse 15 says, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. Now that word family is an interesting Greek word. It's the Greek word patria, which is derived from the Greek word for father, pater. And in fact, a much more literal translation of patria than family would be the word fatherhood, right? And so what Paul is saying here is that I bow my knees before the Father, from whom all fatherhood in heaven and on earth derives its name. In other words, all creaturely fatherhood, as real as it is patterned after the reality of God as Father. So Father is original to God, and it has its analog among creatures. Now, it's true that all created fathers are embodied and biologically sexed as male, whereas God is not biologically sexed as male. So part of the analogical reality is that God is a father without being biologically sexed. Human fathers are fathers on account of their being biologically sexed. But it doesn't follow that because there's an analogical difference between fatherhood in God and fatherhood in creatures, that it's necessarily metaphorical. And I think that Paul is telling us just the opposite is true. And among classical Christian theologians, when they're kind of teasing out these language categories and trying to identify the different ways that Scripture speaks about God, they will often appeal to Ephesians 3:14 and 15 as a prime example of this proper category of divine speech, because the name Father is a proper name. It's not a metaphorical name. And so what I think is happening in many of these modern evangelical accounts that are arguing that we should call God Mother is they're failing to give sufficient care and attention to the way that Scripture speaks differently about God. There's different ways the Bible speaks about God. It does speak about him metaphorically. And whenever the Bible uses this motherly imagery for God, it's very clearly in a figure of speech. And interestingly, the Bible doesn't even use the word mother for God as a metaphorical name. It only uses simile, that God is like a mother to Israel. Jesus is like a hen that wants to gather her chicks. It's almost as though the biblical text is taking care to distance the naming of God as mother, even metaphorically, right? We name God Rock metaphorically because Scripture does this. But in terms of the name mother, it's always simile. Whereas with Father, this is the name by which Jesus taught us to pray to God. It's the name by which Jesus prayed to God. It names the first person of the Trinity without reference to creation. It names him in eternal relation to the person of the Son. And this would be, the first person of the Trinity would be Father, whether the world was ever created or not, because the Son is in eternal relation to him. This is what it means for God to be the triune God, right? For the Father to be in relation to the Son, and the Father and the Son in relation to the Spirit. And then the Bible names God Father in relation to us, that having created the world, he is a father to us covenantally. These are special divine names that are used in Scripture very differently than how the motherly imagery is used in Scripture. And so for these reasons, and really I'm just reaching back to classical Christian heritage. I'm reading the Bible the way Christians for millennia have read it and trying to apply these categories to this more recent development in evangelicalism where people are arguing for calling God Mother from the biblical text. I think it's a misuse of the biblical text that we should lean into those images, learn from them, appreciate them, but ultimately we call God Father because God names himself as Father, and we recognize that it's God who has the authority and prerogative to name himself in this way, and that fatherhood among creatures is patterned after that, not the other way around. So I hope this has been helpful in answering the question, should we call God Mother?
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, visit sbts.edu/sample to access free theology lectures from Southern Seminary.